It's indeed a privilege, and we have come to Friday. And the mission texts of Scripture are not exhausted. You'll have to come back next year and the year after that. I sometimes say when I'm talking about cities that the virgin birth is mentioned twice in the Bible. I would believe it if it were just mentioned once, but it is mentioned twice. The word city occurs in the text 1,250 times, 1,090 in the Old Testament and 160 in the New, and we still have people pastoring in cities who don't know that there are more than 25 kinds of urban ministry in the historical books alone of the Old Testament. So we have a great deal of mining to do on these contemporary mission issues. Today I want to talk about the drama of New Testament evangelization, and I want to use the story of Philemon as the centerpiece of the drama, a drama which will be in 5 acts. The background to the story begins with Paul's second mission journey. And so follow me briefly as we ramp up to Ephesus, where the first act begins. After the Jerusalem Faith and Culture Conference in Acts 15, where the early church had to sort through what is the gospel and what is culture, because once the church moved off the map and comfort zone of Judaism, they had to always be asking, is this a faith question or is this a love issue? And the early church sorted that in Acts 15. They had to do that. As Martin Kaler in one of his brilliant books in 1909 says, mission is the mother of theology. And it's mission that forces the church to ask new questions. And so as the early church crossed the boundaries, all of a sudden looking back at Judaism, they were forced to wrestle with some issues. And so in Acts 15, we have the Gospel in Our Culture Conference, the first ever. And these conferences, by the way, are still going on in the modern era. And Leslie Newbigin, the late Leslie Newbigin, is one of those who's made an incredible mark on the church with the gospel in our culture discussions in our own time. When Paul left for his second journey, he went to Europe. It was a struggle, but he went to Philippi. Now, Philippi is named for Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. Philippi was a middle-class or upper-class suburb. It was not exactly a middle-class community. The first church in all of Europe was founded then in a suburb, an upper-class suburb. Now, when Paul went to Philippi, he discovered something. There was already a pre-existing women's Bible study group. Lydia, a fashion designer at Vogue, the local purple seller of expensive cloth, was already there, and she was conducting a women's Bible study on a regular basis down by the river. Now, it's interesting that when Paul moved into the city, he did not do an end run around the ministry that was already there. In fact, it's important to notice that the apostle built on the foundation of the women. And not only that, incorporated the church in Lydia's home. That she would have a home is in fact a mark of her status in the community and her affluence. And so the apostle, whose name is indelible in the New Testament, who's the mission strategist par excellence, surprises us again. He comes to a new continent, does not tell the women to wear covered heads or shut up and be silent. Rather, he builds on their work, joins it, and puts women in charge, and it's in the house of a woman. And this is the legacy of the European church. Now, when Paul moves in the next chapter, he goes to Athens. Athens is not a suburb, nor is it an industrial city like Corinth. Athens is Boston. Athens is Paris. Athens is San Francisco, or the Bahia coast of Brazil. It is one of those places where culture is dominant. It had long since ceased to be the political capital, but it was the cultural capital of the Greco-Roman world. And Paul could not, I'm sure, veil his excitement as a student of Greek culture and Greek history as he entered that great city. As Stephen Neal said in his History of Mission, Paul had grown up in the fair-sized city of Tarsus. He was bicultural and multilingual, and the early church was fortunate to have him as the architect of their urban mission. As E.M. Blakelock said in his book, Cities of the New Testament, in the preface, the Apostle Paul followed the contours of the urbanized Roman Empire. The smallest place he ever went, so far as we know, was Thessalonica. And so Paul now moves in chapter 17 into the cultural center of the ancient world. And the first thing he does is a museum tour. He goes out into the city and studies all the sculptures. And if you've ever been to Athens, you know they're everywhere. They're on every corner. Streets that are the most obscure, they are on, and surprising places, of course, as the city has grown like Topsy over centuries. But Paul went to all of the sculptures that he could find, and then he went to the scholar's place. It would be like the Sproul Hall steps at Berkeley, I suppose, in the 60s. He went to a place where people gather, and it is expected that scholars will give an address. And Paul used that occasion to quote Greek poets. And so you may remember how he began. He says, I've toured your sculptures, and I've seen that you people are very religious. So much so that you've even built a sculpture to the unknown God, so that you wouldn't offend that God if that God actually happened to exist. Well, that's the God I've come to tell you about. What a wonderful way to scratch where they itch. Now you see, so far as we know, Paul didn't do that anywhere else, because this is the cultural city. And so the museum tour, the scholar's address, the quoting of Greek poets was all expected, because Paul understood that you have to speak to your audience. I was asking a very famous homiletician, Haddon Robinson, one time, not long ago, we were talking about preaching. And he said, you know, the old preacher used to ask, what is my text? But today's preacher also has to ask, who is my audience? And the Apostle Paul was very, very good at that. And so we see in Acts 17 that he used the scholarly approach. Now, Acts 18, he went to Corinth. Corinth was a 5-mile-long strip city on the Achaean Peninsula. There were 2 ports that are connected today by a canal. But in those days, there was no canal. And the ships would unload at one side of town, and the cargo would be dragged through the town and reloaded in many cases and shipped on. It would save often weeks of very perilous, treacherous turns around that bulging, rocking seacoast of Greece. When Paul moved to Corinth in Acts 18, you'll notice, and particularly if you read the letters, that he decided not to be clergy. The clergy was so mucked up he didn't want to be part of it. They were all competitive there, so what he did was start a leatherworks business. Now, there's a Lutheran scholar that wrote and published a doctoral dissertation called Tent Making and Apostleship. And what he shows in his book is that the most strategic vocation in any ancient city in the Middle East was leatherworking. You see, many things were made of leather: clothing, shoes, carpeting, even furniture. And the biggest thing, well, saddles for animals, but the biggest thing that tent makers made, or leatherworkers made, was tents for the affluent who would be traveling on the road, because there were no Motel 6s with the lights on in those days, as you may well recall. And so 10 to 12 miles in a sandal culture, and then you pitch your tent and you set up for the night. Now, according to this scholar, this Lutheran scholar, the Apostle Paul, in order to have a leatherwork business, would have to know the rural animal keepers, because that's the source of hides. He would have had to employ blue-collar workers, because that's the people whose skill is to take this hide, tan it, cut it, sew it, and make it into products. Paul would have to know the affluent of the town, because those are the people who are going to buy his products. So when you read in the New Testament that Paul was a tent maker, understand what that really means. He was a leather worker, and that he knew the constituency in that community from top to bottom. His customers would be affluent, his workers and peers would be middle class and blue collar, and his suppliers would often be peasants from the countryside. In fact, said the Lutheran scholar, a more strategic vocation could not be imagined. So when Paul moved into Corinth, which is a blue-collar worker city, the glory of Corinth had ceased about 100 years before. Disastrous fires, earthquakes, and wars had reduced Corinth. It had lost much of its luster. It looks a little more now like Joliet or Lockport, where John is pastor. It's yesterday's town. It's the urban version of Lake Wobegon. The buildings are there, but the memories are gone. And Lockport, Joliet, the river towns. Think of some of the older sections of Cincinnati. Think of some of the river towns where the buildings are sort of abandoned, and there are some of those little trophies. So Corinth is that kind of town. So what Paul did was not what he did in Philippi, and that's not what he did in Athens. Instead, he made leather work, and he worked there to try to bring reconciliation and stability and maturity and health to a broken and divided church, Corinth. Now in Acts 19, Paul went to Ephesus. Ephesus, the third largest city in Asia after Sion, China, at that time, and Alexandria, Egypt. This was the largest pluralistic city in West Asia. And Paul moved into that city with a desire, first of all, to reach Jews. And so according to Acts 19, Paul went to the synagogue. And this is the beginning of Act 1 in the Philemon story. Paul went to the synagogue, and when Paul went to the synagogue, he tried his best to reach Jews. Well, he tried, but after 3 months, there were disturbances in the synagogue, and they threw him out. So the text of Dr. Luke says that he rented a theater. He rented a theater. The Schole of Tyrannus, it is called. The Schole is the Greek and the Latin word for school, but in Greek it means leisure. And the reason Schole in Greek meant leisure is only the leisure classes had the opportunity to go to school and to the theater. Now, you've seen pictures of Greek amphitheaters, small ones and big ones. This was probably a fairly small amphitheater, and we don't know if it had a roof on it. Some did, many were just outdoors. That he rented it, as one footnote in many of your Bibles says, and it's a well-attested footnote, goes way back to the early manuscripts. It says he rented the theater for 5 hours a day. It's from the 5th to the 10th hour daily, from 11 o'clock to 4 o'clock every day for 2 years. That's extraordinary. That's probably also the cheapest time to rent a theater without a roof on it, because in the Middle East it's very hot. And we just don't know whether they had a roof on this at all. But you see, it is also clear in the text that Paul changed his method here. Now, if you want to know what Paul talked like when he spoke to Jews, read the book of Romans in one sitting. Okay? 16 chapters. Just sit down and read it. It'll take half a day. But if you read it, and read it carefully, you will notice, you'll notice, that Paul quotes the Old Testament about 97 times. He quotes the Old Testament in the Hebrew text, and in paraphrase, and Greek text. Paul was a walking Bible encyclopedia. And when he talked to rabbis, he used the rabbinic method. And the rabbinic method is to go back and document the covenants and the promises of God, and just keep reminding the people of the covenants and the promises, the exile, the prophets, the Psalter, all of those books. And Paul, in the book of Romans, gives us one rabbinic argument. In the whole book, it's one rabbinic argument. But you see, when Paul went out to speak to Greeks in the city, that kind of communication doesn't work. And so Luke says Paul used a participle. Now, I'm telling you, that's what he used, because it says he dialogued. He dialogued. The Greek word dialogumenos is the same word in English. Dialogue. That's Socratic method. That's questions and answers. Somebody asks a question, and Paul talks for an hour. It's like you keep putting money in him, and he just keeps coming back with answers. That's Socrates, the method that the Greeks understood. Now you understand what I've been saying. Move over Minnesota mining and manufacturing, because Paul gives us a new 3M to think about. Paul varied the message, he varied the meeting place, and he varied the method in his approach to reach urban audiences. One size did not fit all. When Paul came to a city, he did some contextual analysis, he understood something about audiences, and he was secure enough and creative enough to vary the method, the message, and even the meeting place. And Paul knew, of course, that Jews don't come to theater, usually, and Greeks don't come to synagogues, usually. And so he went where people are. Evangelism in many of our churches is a little like something else, where we bring a barrel into the sanctuary on Sunday, we fill it up full of water, and then we invite fish to jump in it so we can catch them. Now, if you could imagine that metaphor, that is really stupid, you know. But congregations in this country have tended to fish for souls that way. You know, if you have fished at all, that you have to go where fish are. You have to change the bait. And some of them will be caught on top with a fly, and some deep, deep down with worms and spoons, and some with nets, and some in the hot, warm water seasons, and some in the cold water seasons where you chop holes in the ice. Now, you know that. Well, then how is it that we would assume that we could fish for Jesus by creating an artificial pond in our sanctuary and invite the community to jump in to be caught? It's just, if we build it, they will come mentality. It is not generally happening. But Paul understood the church has to go where people are, and evangelism basically is scratching people where they itch in the name of Jesus. Scratching people where they itch in the name of Jesus. In Act 1, Paul worked for 2 years, 5 hours a day in the theater. And according to Dr. Luke in Acts 19, verse 10, this is the summary. The gospel was heard all over Asia. The way Luke put it is, all Asia heard the gospel. That's Lucan hyperbole. Doesn't mean every last person in Asia heard the gospel. It means that the province of Asia had been penetrated. Now the city, you see, is a woofer and a tweeter of an amplifier system. And when you penetrate the city, the countryside gets the message. And so Paul understood that, and Luke understood that. And in Act 1, we see the result of urban evangelism. The province heard the gospel. The city had been penetrated. 2 years of dialogue in the theater, 2 years in dialogue with leadership, the leisure classes, the school folks, and the gospel had spread throughout the province of Asia. That principle still holds. The cities, in fact, are the amplifying system in every culture. And it is strategic for evangelism that we raise God consciousness there, and the ripple will be felt in the countryside. It's not easy to do, and it's very expensive to do it. I don't know what it costs for Paul to rent the theater 5 hours a day for 2 years. There's no price tag put on it, nor does it say who stepped up to pay for it. There's so many of these biblical models that I wish I knew about. You probably have seen the cartoon about Moses. He's coming down the mountain. He's got a tablet under each arm, and all of a sudden he stops and looks up to God and says, "What about funding?" You know, I wonder about that too. I wonder, where did those biblical ideas get paid for? And this is one of those cases. Now, apparently, Philemon and his wife, Apphia, attended the theater. It's not unreasonable to assume that a landowner and slave owner of wealth in the Lycus Valley, 90 miles away. In fact, I don't know exactly if this is 90 miles from Milwaukee, but it's pretty close. That's about how far Laodicea and Colossae were up country, up the Meander River to the Lycus Valley. That's about how far it was from Ephesus up to the twin cities of Colossae and Laodicea. Those were market towns, like county seat towns, like Princeton, just a few blocks away here. And they don't have theaters there. A lot of antique shops and a few other things, but they don't have the cultural amenities. If you're in this state, you go Madison or you go Milwaukee or a few other places for those. And in the ancient world, people would come into the big city to buy supplies. And they would come with servants who would buy the supplies. And I think I can see that Mr. Philemon took his wife and probably did some time in theaters and concerts and museum tours and things like that in the big city. Well, guess what? Apparently he heard Paul. Because now we come to Act 2 in our drama. When Paul wrote the book of Philippians, in verse 2, he notes something. He greets them later from Rome, but he says, to the church in your house. We know for a fact that Paul did not visit Laodicea and Colossae. You see, the side effect of urban evangelism will be church planting, but not always in the city where the evangelism is done, you see. We have to have a bigger field of vision to see what God is possibly going to do whenever we work in this way. And so, maybe the people who paid for the evangelism in the big city were disappointed at the results. There may not have been a lot of churches start in the actual place where the theater was working. And they may have said, Paul, I'm sorry, but we didn't have a lot of good results here. But the camera lens is bigger. And apparently the gospel bounced up country. And Philemon took the gospel home that he got in the theater, and he put a church in his house. And in Act 2, he had a slave named Onesimus, which, by the way, means profitable or useful. That's what Onesimus means. Those who have analyzed the slave culture of that valley have argued that this is a Phrygian slave, certainly not a black slave, but probably a captured slave. A slave that would be indentured for life, perhaps, and a slave that would be somewhat trusted. But this slave, as you know in Acts 2, stole money and used it to pay for his trip, and he went far away. In fact, he took the money and ran, far as we can tell, probably by roads. You know, all roads lead to Rome. Remember hearing that? Well, a Roman senator once added, and all sewers also. Not only do the roads lead to the big city, but the sewers run downhill, and the city tends to be a catch basin of at-risk or people who run from the law. We shouldn't expect it. It's always been that way. Because in a city you can hide. As we know from our Jericho story the other day, you can hide in the big city. And so Onesimus ran away from Asia to Europe. He is an intercontinental refugee. He's a migrant who stole money in Asia, and he ran away to Europe to get lost in the crowd. And that's the end of chapter 2. A very disappointed house church. A house church which is missing the offerings, perhaps. A landowner who's embarrassed at misplaced trust in a slave. And a fleeing slave who runs away to Rome to get lost in a crowd. Now, 10 years later, now Paul began in Act 1 would be about 53. Act 2 would be about 54 or 55. But 10 years later, in 63 actually, Paul moved into Rome. And that's the third act of our little drama, the drama of world evangelization. In Acts chapter 3, Paul moved into Rome. And in Acts 28, verse 30, it says, he rented a house for 2 years at his own expense. So we know Paul moved into Rome. We also know that Paul had 6 associates who were working with him because he, in Rome, was under house arrest, and he was not allowed to venture freely out into the city. Rome was in 2 parts. North of the Tiber River was Latin Rome, European Rome. South of the Tiber River, there was a large section south of the Colosseum, if you've ever been there, near the St. Paul Church, not surprisingly, under which are catacombs, by the way, in Rome. Not surprising that South Rome became ethnic Rome, Asian Rome, if you please. Now, Paul's associates we know from many scriptures, like Colossians and Philemon and others. Tychicus, who was from the Lycus Valley and spoke the same dialect that Onesimus and Philemon would have. Epaphras, also from that area. Aristarchus, Lucas, Demas, and Marcus. I've given them all Greek names. They're all Greeks. It's pretty obvious that they didn't move into Latin Rome. There was already a church in Latin Rome. They moved into ethnic Rome, into Asian Rome, which was an unreached, seething bed of absentees and aliens who were coming to Rome, hoping to get work in factories and living in airless tenements. Their life expectancy was very short. Disease was rampant. The pitioles, which were the open cesspools which became the graveyards of the poor, were often just collecting corpses until they reached street level, and then they would be covered up. Lanciani, an Italian archaeologist, has given us this graphic and not so nice picture of what it was like to live in the hovels of the ancient cities. The houses were built close together, very cramped, for 2 reasons. Basically, land was expensive, but more than that, it was brutally hot in the summer and very cold and windy and damp in the winter, and so people huddled up. But that also meant disease spread. And so you can think of the bubonic plague, the rat flea victims, the bloated bodies, the fires, and the scorched people that would have been buried there. It was into those places that Paul rented a house, and where he, according to Acts 28, verse 23, would argue with people from morning to night, whether they be Jews or Romans. You see, his team of 6 were out in the streets contacting people, and then they would bring them back to the house. Now, Paul couldn't rent a theater, so he rented a house because he wanted to do evangelism. You see, as I said, Paul varied the method, the message, and the meeting place everywhere he went to fit the city and to fit the audiences with which he was trying to communicate. So Paul is our architect for how we ought to be thinking about cities in the world. Not one size fits all. It will be unique to the different contexts. There will be parallels, of course. There are some cities that are industrial, like Pittsburgh in the old days, Chicago in the old days, Sao Paulo, and perhaps Belo in Brazil are all industrial cities. They come from that paradigm. Rio is a cultural city, see? And so other cities, Varanasi in India, where they bury on the Ganges or bathe in the river, cultural city. And you have Delhi, Washington, D.C., cities like that, which are political cities, capital cities, where people live schizophrenically in the culture because they live in Delhi, but they're representatives of something back home. And so the way the city breathes and moves is very, very differently. And then, of course, there are other genre of cities. In developing countries, we have primate cities like Mexico City or Singapore, which have all those functions rolled into one. And it, interestingly enough, is infinitely more complex than a tribe, But most mission agencies would not even think of sending somebody to a tribal culture without language and culture study. And yet I have discovered that there are mission agencies which will throw people into these cities with no training at all. It's very sad. And usually the city crushes the missionaries because of that. Because the missionaries have no concept of how cities function when all these tribal dynamics are brought together. And people are not the same. When you move into Mexico City from the countryside, your heartbeat is faster. Not only that, when you walk down the street, you don't see things. Because the way we are made, have you ever driven down the highway and all of a sudden you ask yourself, did I stop at the stop sign? Has that ever happened to you? Of course. You see, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, says Psalm 139. And one of the ways we're made is to routinize some of these basic things so they don't take any emotional energy. Otherwise, we'd hemorrhage emotionally every time somebody walked into our life. It's what social psychologists call the elevator syndrome. The more of us you pack into an elevator, the less we communicate. Have you noticed that? Well, Ford Foundation's funded huge studies on this. And the fact is, when you gather people into a city and they're living closer and closer together, I can assure you, we walk down the street and we don't even see people. We walk by signs and we don't see them. Our mind has this capacity to check out. Of course, you add to that the cocooning that's going on with people walking around with headsets now. And you understand that when you come into a city, you're not coming into a city where a whole lot of rural people live like rural people. They have been transformed by life in the city. So the methodologies have to change and to account for that. And we therefore have to come up with very different ways to approach cultures like that. And so Paul understood that. Paul understood it very well. So Paul intensified the relational approach to evangelism, had 6 assistants on the streets, and we know that some of them knew the languages of the Lycus Valley and some were from other places. Now here's what I think happened in Acts 3. Our refugee was down in the market one day, and somewhere between the market and the park, he heard some preaching. And he was stunned to hear his accent. And perhaps it was Brother Tychicus sharing Jesus in the language of the Lycus Valley. Whatever it was, he drew closer, and he got sucked in and found the gospel in Rome. And of course, he was taken over to Paul's house, where Paul discipled him and mentored him. And so in Act 3, as we come to the end of this act, Paul is now saying to him, you must go back and be reconciled. And he agreed. And so Paul wrote this beautiful little letter, which I want now to have you look at, if you have your Bible, just briefly for the next few moments. In Act 3, Paul sat down and wrote. This is the only personal letter from Paul that we have in the Bible. It fits on one page. In Greek, it's 330 words. It's just very, very short. In fact, it doesn't even fill up the whole page in most of our Bibles. It's a little longer than the Gettysburg Address, which is 276 words. But it has the same punch, if you understand what he's saying. Now, first of all, in the first 3 verses, he's starting out as a kind of bleeding heart. Paul, a prisoner. Paul's under house arrest, can't go anywhere. So he's evoking sympathy right from line 1. And he's talking about Philemon and grace and so on, the benediction. Then, beginning of verse 4 through 7, he butters him up really good. Another way to say it is he's sticking the knife in him really slowly, and he's going to turn it in verse 9. He says, you have no idea how much joy we get here in our imprisonment, thinking about you and your prayer life. Your spirituality is a legend in our place. You know, he just goes on and tells all these great things. You obviously know that he's ramping up to a pretty steep request, which then he begins to touch in verse 9. It's about Onesimus, whose father I have become in my imprisonment. Read between the lines. Onesimus is a son. Philemon is a son. What does that make the two of them? Brothers. So what he is delicately doing is introducing one brother to another brother. It's dad sharing the family. And it's very wonderfully done. He says, I would rather come myself. I want you to know that in sending your newest little spiritual brother, I'm sending my heart to you. Evoking all kinds of wonderful imagery. And then in verse 15, he gives us one of those theological reflections I mentioned the other day. He says, perhaps this is why he was taken from you for a little while, so you could have him back forever. Now, Paul he's the master of understatement. What do you mean, taken from me? He ripped me off, stole my money, ran away, embarrassed me in the community. What do you mean, taken from me? Paul, in this theological reflection, is giving us a hermeneutical window through which we are invited to see a bigger picture about refugees. Refugees are not victims. They are potential missionaries. This refugee, you see, has come all the way from Asia. He has come to Rome. God is not surprised, and God is not too weak to deal with that. You see, Psalm 24:1 is still in the book, isn't it? Did you check today? What does Psalm 24:1 say? The earth is whose? The Lord's. And last I checked, it's still in the book. And doesn't belong to any country. And so we're invited to see this big drama on a bigger canvas. It's not just a personal thing. It's a missiological thing. An Asian stole money. He was taken from you for a little while so that you could have him back forever. Well, I don't think he wanted him back, frankly, but he gets it. Now Paul does a very interesting thing. He's going to deal with the economics of this. By the way, he's coming not as a slave. He's coming as brother. He has an identity shift here. He's no longer the same person. Then he says this most interesting thing. In Greek, we have a conditional sentence. It's called the subjunctive mode. And a fourth class subjunctive mode Paul uses here. He says, if he owes you anything. What he means is, it's the subjunctive form. Since he ripped you off, is what he's really saying. Charge it to my account. Now wait a minute. Does Paul have a line of credit in Asia? Oh yeah, look at the next verse. I remind you, you owe your very life to me. Isn't that subtle? Okay. If he owes you, which means since he owes you, charge it to my account. I have a line of credit there. You owe me your very life. Charge it to that account. Then he goes on and finally he says, fix up your guest room. I'd like eventually to come and see how things are working out. Signed, Love, Paul. Now he rolls this letter up, like all ancient letters, into a little scroll. And it would be sealed with wax, and Paul's signature ring would be put on it. This little letter would be hand-carried by Tychicus and Onesimus 1,000 miles back to the Lycus Valley, to the house church. This is all that stands between them and judgment. Paul's cover letter. Now this was about the eve of the year 64. Paul died in 64, so he never saw the fourth act of our drama. But some weeks, maybe even months after they carried this letter, I suspect they were holding evangelistic meetings all the way along, staying with people, telling them about the gospel. One day in Laodicea, there was a knock at the door. And when it was opened, there were these two men. And before anything could be said, a letter is handed and read. The letter we know as Philemon. Shortly after that, Philemon, this is in some texts that only I know about. Philemon went down to the Turkish bath at the Laodicean Tennis Club And he was sitting in the steam room with other owners of plantations. They had also, by this time, heard that a slave had returned. And they were sitting in there in the steam room in the Turkish bath of Laodicean Tennis Club. And Laodicea Tennis Club is one of those places where a few bigots gather. And they were putting some pressure on Philemon. What are you going to do, Philemon? We hear Onesimus is returned. What does the law require, Philemon? Well, the law is very clear. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle had talked about slaves, and Aristotle had written a book called Politics, and the 4th chapter is about slaves. And Aristotle's teaching, written in the 4th century BC, was that a slave was not a person. A slave is property. Not only that, but if a slave ran away and you caught him, you brand him with a hot branding iron, the letter F in Latin, fugitiva, so that if you saw this raised forehead, this deep scar, you would know for the rest of his life that he had been a refugee. But if a slave stole money, you must not brand him, you must execute him. That is Roman law. Deisman, a German scholar, however, more than half century ago, was digging around in the research of ancient Greek and Roman cities and discovered there was a third option. The third option was that you can go down to the county courthouse or its equivalent, and you could buy manumission papers, the freedom of a slave, and set him free. According to law, this would only be done very seldom, and it would only be done where you've had a servant who is about to die and wants to go home and see their folk in the home country, or a trusted servant at the end of his life, where a beneficent dictator could actually give them some freedom. And you would pay the money and set them free. Now, consider those three options. What do you think Paul's expecting Philemon to do? Let's imagine the first option. We have a meeting of the slaves on the old Bar H ranch. The branding iron is steaming there. And he's about ready to stick him, but saying, a wonderful thing has happened to Philemon on the way in his journey. Tell him how you came to know Jesus. And then after that, brand him and let the screams be heard. Or you just stab him, Philemon, I know you're going to meet the Lord in a few minutes, but before you go, would you share with these other slaves how Jesus has set you free mentally so that you don't have to run away physically to be free? And then he stuck him, killed him. Is that, you think, what is supposed to happen here? I think you catch it. That Paul's emphasis, if he owes you anything, charge it to my account. By the way, I hope to see how come and see how things are working out. Paul assumes that this is going to happen. And so I think as the landowners of the Lycus Valley begin to share, it becomes very clear to Philemon what's going to happen. He's going to lose all his slaves. All the slaves are going to be able to run away now and become believers. This is going to be an economic catastrophe in the community, and probably for him and for his church. I suspect this is how Second Baptist Church got started. Those who disagreed and moved across town and started a rival congregation. Those that don't believe in setting slaves free and joining the choir and marrying the daughters. I think all of those kinds of discussions happen. But I think we are to expect that in Act 4 of our drama, we have for the first time in human history an integrated house church where a slave is welcomed into the membership of a church as a brother in Christ, not a slave. Now, Paul had said in his very first book, Galatians, in chapter 3, verse 28, that there's no difference between slave or free, Jew or Gentile, or male or female. But sometimes between the pronouncement and the implementation, it takes time. So far as we know, it took at least 15 years between Paul's writing of that on the eve of the Jerusalem Council in about 49, because the council met in 50. Now we're in 64 or so. So about 15 years later, the Pauline theology gets implemented. Let us remember, as some of you married folks well know, I stood up and you stood up one day before a preacher who pronounced us husband and wife. I've spent 39 years working on that, trying to make that happen. You know that doesn't happen just because it was pronounced at the altar. You know that. And so Paul said there's no difference. But it took at least 15 years, so far as we know, to bring about an integrated house church. That's the drama. Now there's more of that. It's expensive to do urban evangelism because not only do you have to pay the cost of saving people, you have to set them free. You have to pay again. Oh yes, discipleship is costly. The recruiting and evangelizing of people in need and at risk will always cost us, as Lauren Bethel and many others I'm sure can tell you very, very well. You never stop paying for the converts in one way or another. Mission is about that. It's a call to the rest of your life, and your budgets better start reflecting that. You cannot just evangelize and hit and run, and city evangelism is expensive. There's a fifth act in our drama. It comes in the year 110. It's 110. Ignatius is the preacher, and he's preacher in Antioch, the great mission church. We know this from early church history. The curtain has closed. The last living apostle, John, has gone to Patmos, and we don't know how it ended for him, but we know that he disappears off the scene in 96, at the end of the first century, the first Christian century. A decade later, there's a knock at the door in Ignatius' study, and he is arrested and taken off to be executed. On the way to the execution, which took several days, as he was in chains marched from town to town, he was put in jails, local jails, overnight. And when they got him to Smyrna, he wrote a letter back to the bishop of Ephesus. The bishop of Ephesus, in the year 110, had the name Onesimus. Interesting. Scholars, Protestant and Catholic, have looked at that and have studied that. I have a copy of the Ignatian correspondence in my library. It's actually in Library of Christian Classics. You can get it too. But in that, Ignatius uses the same pun. He calls him the profitable bishop. Could this be the same person? A.T. Robertson, who taught for many decades at Southern Seminary and probably the greatest Greek scholar in America, published with Baker Bookhouse before he died a wonderful essay on Onesimus and said there are 12 reasons why this is the same person. Fitzmyer, the editor of the Jerome Biblical Commentary and the leading scholar today of the Pauline letters for the Catholic Church, has looked at all that evidence and says it's the same person. What I'm here to tell you is the fifth act of the drama looks like this. Act 1, Paul did urban evangelism. He rented a theater and he reached Philemon in that process. Act 2, the gospel bounced less than 100 miles or so up to the Lycus Valley, and a house church was formed, and a slave stole money and ran to Rome in Act 3, where Paul was doing outreach in the biggest city in Western Europe, the only city in the ancient world, along with Xi'an, China, that had 1 million or more people at that time. And in that Asian fermenting slum on the south side of the city, the slave was touched by Christ and by Paul. This little letter was written, and he goes back to the house church and is welcomed in and becomes a discipled leader in the house church. Then sometime after 96, the pulpit committee of the Ephesus church has a meeting. And the chairman of the pastor search committee says, ladies and gentlemen, we have a problem. We have to find a new leader for the church. Let's talk a little more about the last couple leaders we had before we move on to the future, shall we? Now, who are two of the most famous leaders of the church of Ephesus? Timothy and John. And so the chairman says, our task is to replace the last living apostle. I think you could put all the candidates in a phone booth. Who could possibly replace the beloved disciple? None other than John. Is it not surprising to you? I mean, Gabriel, Michael, and Billy Graham aren't available, right? You got to go find somebody. Is it not amazing to you that within a decade or so of the death and disappearance, the departure of the last living apostle, the Ephesus church, the most strategic church in all of Asia, had a former slave as its pastor and leading bishop? But there's more. How did this get into the New Testament? A.M. Greenslade, a British scholar, is part of a trilogy of essays in the History of the English Bible, Volume 1, 2, and 3. And there's a very interesting essay on this. One of the things we know is that when Paul's letters were first written, they were circulated independently. Colossians church had letters, and the Ephesian church had letters, the Thessalonian church had letters, and they would copy them, and then they make mistakes in them too sometimes, and they would trade them. I think church would get on the phone, call the Ephesus church and say, we got 2 Philippians and no Colossians, we'll trade you one of our Philippians for the book of Hebrews and a draft choice, or something like that. Actually, the churches were trading these books back and forth, but we know something. The first attempt to gather the books into one was Marcion the heretic. The second attempt, according to the scholar Greenslade, happened in Ephesus early in the 2nd century. Who do you suppose collected your New Testament? And in a secret text known only to me, I have this suggestion. As Philemon lay on his deathbed one day, he said to his now bishop, the young Onesimus, I don't have any money to give you. You ripped me off, remember? But I have something nobody else has. I have a personal letter about you. I have the story of an international migrant who became the bishop of Ephesus. And I think he took that little letter and he kind of stashed it in your New Testament to be the personal testimony of an international refugee who became a bishop of Ephesus, the largest church in East Asia. Does that happen today? I was in Damascus, one story, a few years ago. I went to John of Damascus Anglican Church on Sunday. You know what? The choir was black in Damascus, Syria. I thought, well, this is a bit strange. The Anglican Church in an Arab country, Damascus, Syria, has an African choir. Oh, surprise. That afternoon, the American embassy gave a party for the two of us who had come, because almost no Americans come there anymore, so we had several hundred people gathered, and they invited Christian choirs from the city of Damascus to come, and every single choir was black. And finally I said to Bishop Shabo of the Syrian Orthodox Church, are all the choirs in Damascus black? He said, oh, did you ever hear of Idi Amin? I said, well, yes, of course, the dictator of Uganda. Well, Idi Amin did what Nebuchadnezzar did a few years ago. He had the goal of making Uganda into a fanatically Muslim Marxist country. And so he went out to the villages and got all the best, brightest young men he could find. Now, he searched the world to find the best university where he could turn them into Muslim Marxists. And the best place to do that is Damascus, because the Ba'ath Party, while being Muslim, is very secular. So you can be both a Marxist and a Muslim. And so this huge university is filled with Africans from Uganda. The Nebuchadnezzar model, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's of our day, and Daniel, going to school. Now, it is against the law to evangelize Syrians. It is not against the law to evangelize Africans studying Marxism and Islam in the Syrian university. So Pastor Adib Awad and the other pastors in town organized prayer groups all over the city, and Adib was telling me about it. It's like Hong Kong there. There's a mountain above the city. He took me up on the mountain, pointed out all over town where the Bible study and prayer groups were. Guess what? Almost all of Idi Amin's Africans were led to Christ in Damascus, Syria, while studying Muslim Marxism, and are now back in Africa helping President Museveni rebuild Uganda, which is one of the most promising countries in Africa right now. Is there a God? There is a God. Does Onesimus still happen in our own day? It is still happening, dear friend. To God be the glory, to the earth be peace, to the Baptist be courage, and to the world be hope. Amen.